Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our discussion of the beginning of Chapter 16, covering sections 1 and 2. At this point, you should have read those sections in the textbook over the last couple days and completed the reading guide that goes along with that. So sections 1 and 2 are going to cover our first learning objective, and the second learning objective will be covered later in sections 3 and 4, and we'll get to that tomorrow. So today we're going to focus a little smaller piece, talk about Darwin's trip, his conclusions about evolution, and how he identified and described the process of natural selection. And then next time, we'll talk about his process and evidence for evolution. So one of the biggest things that we understand about Darwin was he made a lot of his claims based on his travels on the HMS Beagle. He was invited as a naturalist to travel with the ship and document the organisms that he observed along the way. So throughout his travels, he was making a lot of observations about the characteristics of the organisms that he saw. So as he traveled throughout the world, notice that he spent a lot of time in more tropical regions or southern hemisphere regions. And that resulted in him observing a lot of environments he would not have seen in Europe, where he was from. So seeing all of these different environments allowed him to see a much broader set of data than he might have had he not gone on his trip. And because of his observations, he came up with a theory of evolution that explains how modern organisms evolved over especially long periods of time through descent from common ancestors. So this unit is really going to be breaking down those ideas and making sense of them and looking at evidence for how that occurs. So there were 3 conclusions or observations that he saw as he made his trip throughout the world. The first thing that he identified is that in different locations on the globe, species vary. When you look at different places, there are different species that exist because those environments aren't the same everywhere. So living things vary or differ depending on what part of the world they're in. The second observation he made is that even in close locations, locally, there's variation that occurred. So the Galapagos Islands are a region near the equator that have a lot of different kind of untouched organisms. There hasn't been as much human interaction. Well, these days there's a lot more research there, but at the time of Darwin, they were pretty pristine and left alone. And what he noticed is that many species seem to have a subset of similar characteristics, but for example, these tortoises, in each of the islands, they had slight variations that were specific seemingly to each island's conditions. So every island had slight variations in their terrain and their food sources, and the different species that lived on each island differed from each other. The other thing that he observed is that species vary over time. So glyptodonts are a more historic organism that we see evidence of in the fossil record. So they are not necessarily living today, but they share some characteristics with armadillos. So their general structure is very similar, but you'll notice that the overall size of armadillos is significantly smaller than these glyptodonts. So over time, while some features may be similar and maintained, other features are going to change based on environmental conditions. So now we're going to talk about some of the ideas that influenced Darwin or gave him some basis for the conclusions that he made. 2 significant geologists, people who study kind of the history of Earth, one of the biggest claims that they made was that Earth is ancient. They said Earth is really old. And they made that conclusion based on observing patterns in rock formations and how long it takes for them to occur. Think about the Grand Canyon. Most of the Grand Canyon is due to erosional factors of water with the river that runs through it. As moving water goes through the rocks, it will weather and erode the material, cutting into the rock surface. In order for a feature this large and dramatic, if you think about it, to have formed, there must have been a lot of time in Earth's history in order for that to occur. So based on how long it takes for events needed to cause these geologic features, Hutton and Lyle suggested that Earth is really old. Lamarck was another researcher that actually first suggested that species are not fixed and that they changed, but his mechanism or his means for it occurring was incorrect. He based his data on acquired characteristics. So if we look at our water bird here with the long legs, what he suggested is that in order to wade deeper and get more food, the birds would actually grow their legs longer. Well, the problem is that the legs are based on genes. The DNA codes for certain lengths of legs within the birds. Leg length is not something they can change themselves by willing their legs to grow longer. So when Lamarck proposed that these species change, he just had it wrong in the way that it happens. So when we look at how organisms change, it's not something that individuals can do. It is based on individual. I can't spell today. Sorry, guys. Let's fix that. Individual. There we go. So populations can change through evolution, but not individual organisms. They're stuck with the DNA and the traits that they get. Another theorist or researcher was someone named Thomas Malthus, and he was really doing a lot of conclusions about human population. At a time where war and famine were affecting resources and availability to humans, he proposed that if human populations just kept growing and producing more and more humans, there's only so much food and space and resources available, and at some point there wouldn't be enough living space for all humans that might be in existence. So far, as we look at human population growth, we still haven't met that peak yet. We're still in exponential growth. What Darwin realized as he reflected on this is that it applied to living organisms as well. So here we see a Daphnia. It's a small kind of water living creature. Initially, there's not a lot of Daphnia, so it takes a while for the ones that exist to reproduce and create more offspring. But then as they create more offspring, we suddenly see a huge increase in the number of Daphnia. What we see here is there's actually kind of a big peak, and then it kind of like up here, I have more Daphnia living than can be supported by the environment. They are competing for resources, and then we have a little bit of die-off. And then once we hit the point where we're kind of living with the environment, there is a plateau, which is really the amount of Daphnia that the resources can support. So Darwin thought, hey, at some point you're going to run out of resources to support any more organisms than a certain point. The last piece that Darwin observed was that humans actually selected for traits and could change the characteristics of populations over time. This is called artificial selection. You might be familiar with dog breeds. Humans originally domesticated breeds based on the wolf. So dogs are simply domesticated wolves. What they would do is they would look for characteristics in certain dogs and breed together the ones that had the characteristics they wanted. So if you wanted a small dog that could burrow into a space after a digging rodent or something, you might favor a dachshund. Depending on wanting to do larger work or stronger work, you might have bred in favor of a more muscular, strong dog like a bulldog. But as dog breeders looked for the traits they wanted and then bred the dogs that had those, they eventually developed different breeds of dogs that showed the traits that they wanted. This is very similar to what happens in the environment when the environment selects which traits are successful. Now, dogs are a very common example of artificial selection, but there are a lot of plant and food-based items that have happened this way as well. You might be surprised to know that many vegetables are actually modifications of wild mustard. So cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, kale, and kohlrabi are all parts of an original common ancestor with wild mustard. So in something here like broccoli, they prevented flowers from forming. They selected for plants that didn't develop the flowers. Kale was selecting for larger leaves. Cabbage, by suppressing the stems from growing taller, the leaves overlap each other and create this large head. I believe that I've also heard that Brussels sprouts would fit into this family as well. So as people saw different parts of the plant that could be beneficial and selected for those characteristics when they bred, we found many different types of vegetables developing from those choices. So Darwin made a lot of observations based on his trip with the HMS Beagle. It allowed him the opportunity to make observations in parts of the world he would not normally have traveled. And as he started to reflect on what he observed in the variation of traits globally, locally, and over time, he was influenced by observations that the earth is really old, that artificial selection occurs, and that when you have populations growing unchecked, eventually there's going to be a limit on that growth because you're going to run out of resources. In our next class, we are going to talk about what some of the evidence is for the proposed process of natural selection that Darwin came up with. So today's work is simply to answer the questions and submit your work on the Ed Puzzle video.